the kind of life they lived, and the connections that folks had from if you're going to take a picture of me, Jim, I'm going to take a picture of you. The connections they had with the rest of the world. Hey, Mona, I consider this kind of a big win for Shiloh interpretation, since we're going to go ahead and do it on the back porch. Take a couple pictures of us while we get started. Stand up straight. Give Mona your best picture. Hello, Mona. Because this is definitely a program that you've earned, especially Jeannie, who's paid for this program. But
it's my fault,
well, thankful that
it's my fault. I said this is a perfect opportunity for you to turn on programming.
But let's plunge ahead. But the first thing I want to, the first of the various incidents involving this program is not this, and it's not the fact that we're doing it on the porch of the visitor center, and it's not on the porch the fact that we got rained out. First incident happened at about 3:30 this morning when suddenly I jarred awake. I just jarred awake. I didn't sit up in the bed screaming like they do in the movies. I always figured that would throw their backs out. But I jarred awake, and I lay there grinning. I lay there grinning in terror at the thought that I had just driven 500 miles from Chicago to rural West Tennessee to talk to a bunch of people who probably live in the country, what it is like to live in the country.
There's some irony there.
Thank you. Yes, that is my sense of irony. Although irony is one word, although at the moment it was a little more like terror. But yes, I want to talk about, so this isn't necessarily about what it's like to live on the frontier, what it's like to live in the country. I want to try, since I'm not a farmer, but I am an historian, I want us to talk about what it was like for them, for the people that lived here in 1862. What was their life like before the armies got here? And we might even touch a little bit on what their life was like after the armies left. Obviously, the presence of General Grant's army here for 3 weeks would have turned their world upside down, even if General Johnston and his Confederate army had not come to visit General Grant's army in April 6 and 7 of 1862. So let's think a little bit about who these people were, where they came from, what their life was like, and what their relationship was, in a lot of ways, what their relationship was to the outside world. I don't know if outside world is the word for it, since you can't hardly get more outside than where we are, but the world beyond Pittsburgh Landing, the world beyond District 15 of Hardin County, Tennessee. And so, first thing we want to understand is the people that lived here in 1860 were, of course, not the settlers, nor were their parents the settlers, nor any other people like them, the original settlers of this area. People had lived here for thousands of years, for hundreds of years anyway. Of course, we know, the first ones we know are those whose lives are interpreted over here at the Shiloh Indian Mounds historic area. And they left behind plenty of evidence of their lives. And these Mississippian people that lived over at the Shiloh Indian Mounds, they left this series of mounds, and they built them, and they built houses on them, and some of them are, at least one of them is a burial mound, and we learned a little, archaeology tells us a little about their lives and their ceremonies, and one way, and obviously they farmed, like the people that lived here later, but one way that they were uniquely similar to the folks that lived here in 1862 is this. Although this plateau, although Shiloh Plateau overlooking the Tennessee River in Hardin County, Tennessee, was then and is that now quite remote, the lives of these people were connected and in many ways dependent on the rest of the world. So when we talk about Shiloh Frontier Home, the first thing we want to break apart is this notion, this idea of the little log cabin out in a glade in the middle of the wilderness with the smoke coming up, and folks who are totally independent of the rest of the world. Whether we're talking about the Mississippian people, or we are talking about the folks of 1862, or we're talking about our neighbors that came in today, these people are connected to the outside world, and connections to the outside world are crucial to their livelihoods. So they're not alone. They're on the frontier, but they're not alone. A perfect example for that is reflected in the collection here, the collection from Shiloh Military Park, and it's a piece that's currently held, as I believe so, currently held at the Tennessee River Museum up in Savannah, and that's the little pipe, right? The little pipe up at Tennessee River Museum, which archaeologists have traced to the city of Cahokia in Missouri. So we know from the finding of that pipe that the folks that lived out here in the Indian Mounds hundreds and hundreds of years ago traded with the folks at Cahokia. And they had an important connection to the outside world. Therefore, we can assume, and we will demonstrate, that the folks who lived here in 1862, although they were what we consider frontier people, people out on the frontier, the westward expanding frontier of America, they were nevertheless importantly connected to the rest of the country and connected to the market of the rest of the country, and that their success or their failure in trying to make their livelihood out here was connected to the market. Not only did they need to know how to split rails and build cabins and raise farms and draw some food from the earth, they needed to be connected to the market. Now that's important, and we're going to get a little bit get closer to it in a little bit later, I think. But let's at least set the timeline. Statehood for Tennessee is, I'm here visiting, so I'll let you tell me.
1796.
1796. Thank you very much. So as early as 1796, Tennessee was a well-settled, well-traveled place, enough for statehood. But of course, West Tennessee was, at that time, the most remote part of Tennessee. Anything across the Tennessee River and in the western part. But indeed, many of the white people who were traveling west were coming out here and settling. And one of the ways that the government, that the U.S. government wanted to get people to travel west was to offer land on the frontier to veterans of various wars, right? And that serves a couple of purposes for the government. The government may be thinking in the long term, I'll bring up this term, manifest destiny, that we probably all learned in our high school, right? That at least as early as President Polk's administration, when they said it out loud, and probably all the way, we can find all the way back to the Revolution, a feeling that it was manifest that the United States would expand to the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, pioneers, and generally when they say that, they mean white people, need to be moving west to settle the unsettled areas. And they say this without regard to the native peoples that are already there, of course. And therefore, fitting into that strategy, it makes a lot of sense that veterans should be given an opportunity to settle on land in the West. First of all, it makes for a great recompense for that person's service, and on the side of the society back east, or the government back east, it also says we're sending people who are capable of military service, capable of creating new neighborhoods, and if necessary, capable of conquest to the West. And this characterizes some of the first settlers that make it out here. Again, for that we have an example right here at Shiloh. Who here likes catfish? Who here likes to go to Hagee's Catfish down here below the visitor center? And if you've been to Hagee's and you've read their stuff on the wall, and you meet some of the folks that run it, you know that they will proudly tell you that they are living on the land that their ancestor got as their ancestor was awarded by the government for service in the War of 1812. And so, you know, their original Hagee ancestor came west just after the War of 1812, settled, wanted to find some land. There was some land just over the Tennessee River, from where Savannah is right now, and the Hagees were some of the first settlers in this area, and there they still live, and there they still make their livelihood. So that became an important aspect of the people who were going to be here. They were frontier people, but there was also some logic to them being the people that made that journey. And so they came here, and then they established this community, and we would call this the community of Pittsburgh Landing, and it's named for Pittsfield Tucker, who established a dry goods store and grog shop, some say, out here where the National Cemetery is right now. And he did so because he was at a landing area. Let's use as the next point the fact we've already covered that the people are moving west. The next significant piece of geography here, other than the continent, is the Tennessee River. So the Tennessee River runs north from the Great Bend down here, and so the choices that the people around here make as far as where they settle, where they farm, where they travel, who they deal with, are almost all directly or indirectly connected to the Tennessee River. And when they travel by the Tennessee River, and when they trade by the Tennessee River, and when they farm things and produce things that the Tennessee River can help them get to market. And so, getting to market, one of the gifts that the landscape gave them were these landings, places where these high bluffs went down to the Tennessee River in a more gradual way, so that products could be taken to the river and placed on some sort of vehicle and taken down river and traded. So landings were very important. One thing that I think we want to know about Pittsburgh Landing, absent from the military part, is that Pittsburgh Landing is a secondary landing. Right now it seems to us, because of what happened here in the battle, that Pittsburgh Landing is a very important landing on the Tennessee River. It was actually a secondary landing. It's what you would call a high water landing on the Tennessee River. And the reason General Grant landed here instead of somewhere else is because Tennessee River was at flood in March of 1862 when he brought his army up the river. So he used the high water landing. But the high water landing is for the people that live here, is an alternate landing. The high water landing at Pittsburgh Landing is the back door to the Pittsburgh Landing community, not the front door. And so this area is the more remote area, thus illustrated by the fact that the only settlement on this dirt is Pitts Tucker and his shop over here. And there's very little community in the immediate area of Pittsburgh Landing. The most important landing in the area, and the landing that people had used for the longest, we're not counting the Mississippian people who are just over here, is what's now called the community of Hamburg. Just down the road here is Hamburg, Tennessee, and in 1862, Hamburg was a thriving village, and a thriving village because it was an excellent landing spot for the riverboats. And the people that produced stuff here could get them to market at Hamburg, and from Hamburg onto steamboats, and from steamboats onto the Tennessee River. Hamburg did not last as a thriving community. One of the problems, of course, was the river itself. Hamburg, being a low, swampy area, often floods. They tell me that the rock pile had water up above the bar during the recent floods a few weeks ago. And that if you see the houses that are down there in Hamburg now, they're way up on piles. So, as a going concern, Hamburg didn't last. But in 1862, the main town around Pittsburgh Landing was not Pittsburgh Landing itself, it was Hamburg. And then finally, on this topic, the people that settled here, the frontier people that settled here, they were not disconnected from the economy of the country through the market, and they were not disconnected from the political life of the market. So by the time the secession crisis came up, the various topics that led to the secession crisis had played out here at Pittsburgh Landing many times over. A good example is we know that Shiloh Church is, because of the battle, is a significant religious institution to these people in 1862. But Shiloh Church was not the only church in this neighborhood at the time. And there was another church that had since moved away, but there was a church called the Union Church. Both of these churches belonged to the Methodist, Church. But in the 1840s, in the midst of the evangelical awakenings that were sweeping America, sweeping the United States at the time, in the 1840s, the Methodist Church in the South had split. They split over the issue of slavery. And the folks from the Union Methodist Church had been anti-slavery in their point of view, and the folks that split away from them and formed the Shiloh Church were pro-slavery. And so they split apart. They seceded, and they created two churches based on their political differences over the institution of slavery. And indeed, the institution of slavery was right here in the 15th District. Sometimes we tell each other when we first encounter this community that it is so poor that slavery would not have been here, or would not have existed here. No, the census of 1860 tells us that there are many people that are living in this neighborhood, and the count varies, but for now I'm going to give an educated guess of about 24 or more that lived in the 15th district for the census. There were people who were enslaved to other people. There was an African American community, and they were slaves of the white people that live here. That also illustrates that if we think the people around here were all poor, we're going to be wrong on that too. There is going to be an upper class, and there is going to be a lower class. And the various tensions between people based on class all exist in this neighborhood as well. Well, I was kind of winging it for that first part. At this point, we would have been walking over to the cabin to learn a little bit about the physical life of the folks here, and I brought some notes about that especially relate to what we've learned by having a relic of the Battle of Shiloh on this battlefield all of these years, the cabin. So we would walk over to the cabin at this point, and I would say, well, this is the cabin that represents the home in 1862 of William Mansfield George and his wife Nancy and their infant daughter Mary, who had been born in 1860. So maybe Mary was about 2 by now. Pretty sure on that. I'm not going to say 100%. But a little family of 3 living in a log cabin right where that cabin is standing right there. And the various crops and the various landscape around that was being cultivated by Mance George and by whatever labor Mance George could get to work his farm. Now it was not Mance George's farm by law. The farm belonged to his widowed mother-in-law, Nancy's mother, and that is Sarah Bell. Sarah Bell is the owner of all that property. So the peach orchard is Sarah Bell's peach orchard, and the cotton field is Sarah Bell's cotton field, and the mule lot is Sarah Bell's mule lot, and the cabin, Mance George cabin, is Sarah Bell's cabin. But that is the cabin where we would be standing right now, and if we could walk around it, we would see what we would recognize readily as a little frontier log cabin. We would have logs chinked and piled on each other. We would have lathing, a roof there with lathing, and then shakes hammered onto the roof to keep the water out. We would have seen this mud daubed in between the logs. Very important part of the cabin on one end, we would visit the chimney on the west end of the cabin, and we would see how that was built. Now, in order to do a little illustration of the cabin, we're going to depart from the past, from the far distant past, and talk a little bit about the recent past. Last summer, the summer of 2018, the National Park Service had to rehabilitate the battle cabin, which involved a reconstruction, a ground-up reconstruction of the chimney, of the hearth and the chimney. And so I had a chance the other day to sit with Ranger Tom Parson down at Civil War Interpretive Center in Corinth, and Ranger Parson was in charge of the rehab, and we talked a little bit about what it took for them to rehab the cabin, and if we talk about that, in so doing, we should gain some appreciation of what they had to do to construct their homes and live in their homes while they're living here in the Pittsburgh Landing neighborhood. Okay, the cabin is not Mance George's cabin. It's also not Sarah Bell's cabin. The cabin sitting there now is a cabin that George needed to replace a home that was destroyed at the Battle of Shiloh. Okay? So Mance George's cabin was destroyed at the Battle of Shiloh. And he needed to get a home. As soon as the armies had moved on, he needed desperately to get a new home for his little family. And so he contracted with a neighbor, Lewis Wicker. And those of you who know the fields, the names of the fields around Shiloh, know the Wicker Field is the neighboring field to the Peach Orchard area. It's the next one to the north. And so Mance George contracted with Lewis Wicker. Lewis Wicker was living around his field then, but he had previously lived to the north and the west of Wicker Field, and he still owned that property, and he still owned a cabin that sat on that property. And that is property that is now called Perry Field, and you would recognize it as the entrance to Shiloh National Military Park. So we're right where you turned into Shiloh National Military Park at that time, instead of Highway 22 and a big sign, there would have been a cabin. And that is the cabin that Mance George bought from Lewis Wicker. So they needed to move that cabin across the landscape and get it to where Mance George wanted to build it. And so that cabin had to be deconstructed, had to be taken down, had to be moved all the way across, and then it had to be rebuilt where it is now. And they built it there, and George and his family lived in it for a while, and then their fortunes changed and they moved on to some other place. By 1889, that cabin was almost totally run down, almost totally destroyed by just nature, by aging. But by 1895, the government had purchased had purchased a lot of this land for Shiloh National Military Park, and so what was left of the cabin, they began to reconstruct it. And so it was reconstructed, and as the park came online, that battle cabin became the battle cabin that people visited and said, yes, this was an original cabin. It is an original cabin, it's just not Mance George's. It was on the battlefield during the battle, and it was over here by the park entrance. So it is authentic, it's just not, it wasn't there. Yet it has been kept up and rebuilt and repaired many times over the years. 1960 saw a major rebuild of that cabin. And at that time, they rebuilt it, and the contractor that rebuilt it kind of shifted the materials when he rebuilt it. So at that time, it was facing the wrong direction, or a different direction than the way it was that Mance George had built it to face. Not too far off, but wrong indeed. He also built a porch to it, and the idea for the porch was that would be a great place for the National Park Service to do demonstrations. And for a long time, they had living historians out there. A woman would be out there in garb from the time, and she would be cooking over fire and weaving and doing other things from the day, domestic skills and domestic production of the day. But again, over time, that cabin deteriorated, as it always will, because it is largely made from mud, and that mud will always be the first thing to go. It was repaired again in 1984, and then in 2004, the Park Service tore down the porch and engaged in a very interesting project of shifting the cabin so that it now faces back the way it did before. Gosh, I could go through the details, the carpentry details of what they did in 2004, because that would be so much fun. But we're not going to have time to do that right now. Needless to say, a lot of great work went into keeping the cabin the way it is. But what I want to talk about with the little bit of time we have left for this topic right now was how they rebuilt the chimney last summer, because that is going to inform us a little bit about life of the people that lived there in 1862. Now, to build that chimney, it was necessary, first it was necessary to determine whether or not it needed to be rebuilt. They determined that the wood, the pillars holding up the chimney, were integral to the wall of the cabin. And that told them right there was never going to be any other option from fixing the chimney. If they didn't fix the chimney, the wall would collapse. The cabin was already unsafe for people to go in, so it would need to be done. So the chimney had to come down, and the first stage was to build, just as they would have in 1862, new beams. And they bought cut beams, but of course in 1862 they would have cut them by hand. New beams, and the beams were fitted in to where the hearth was in the chimney. Underlaid by that was native stone. So there's a project of going around the park and finding some stone. Now they had some stone from the previous reconstructions. But of course, in 1862, the project is wander around the neighborhood finding native stone that they can use. And that is a project that can be farmed out to some of the young people. Young people in the neighborhood can be sent to, young boys can be sent to find stone and bring it back. And then Mance George is going to, for the first step, he's going to have to be a mason. And he's going to have to build those, lay out those stones and use mud to get them together. And then start to build the base of the chimney out of the timbers that he has cut, and build them up as a small version of what has happened with the rest of the chimney. Above that, he would lay another layer of smaller stone, and he would use his mud to form that stone so that he would need to start. The crib that he built has defined the hearth. So if you go to the other side of the crib, it's defined the hearth to the fireplace inside. Now he's above the hearth, and he needs to start creating a chimney and control the draft. The draft he needs to pull draft from inside. So as he stacked the stones would be stacked closer and closer to the wall of the house, of the cabin. And then once he had got the chimney narrow enough, he would use mud to go on up to the top. Now, this mud that he uses can't just be earth that he pulls up out of the ground. The kind of dirt that would be good for growing his crops would fall apart in the first rain if he just took that mud and stacked it across. So he would need to consult. With either neighbors or some sort of publication that would give him directions to get recipes for the kind of mud he would have to make to build that chimney. He would have to get, and they would tell him, they would have to get, for example, this is from memory, so, but maybe 4 parts mud and mix it with 1 part lime. And so he would say, okay, I've got the mud. Oh, he said they want 4 parts clay and 1 part lime. He said, if I got the clay, if you dig down here enough, usually 2 to 3 feet, you'll hit a layer of clay. You can get some clay. He gets clay out of that. Now he's going to dig the hole and get the clay. Then he needs some lime. Okay, how do you make lime? How does he make lime? Well, the first way you take lime is crush and bake limestone. He doesn't have that. There's not limestone, and readily accessible limestone around here. He couldn't pick it up off of the ground, for instance. So he would use an alternative to that, and a good alternative in making lime to limestone is shells. And so if he dug deep enough here, just like the kids looking for arrowheads, could he find shells down there? And the answer would be yes. You would find all sorts of ancient crustacean shells and this and that. Right down, as long as he dug deep enough or walked around, he could find shells. So he could get the shells, and he could crush them, and he could bake them, and he would get something close enough to lime that it would help make his mud, his daub, as he would have called it. So once he has it, and he gets it together, and there's the parts of the clay and the parts of the lime, and put them together in a hole that he digs in the ground, perhaps, or perhaps he has a wheelbarrow or something that he's built. Add in water slowly until the mixture is just right, and then he has something that he could use to daub up that chimney. The next thing he's going to have to do to fill the gaps in those chinks is bring in grass. And if he brings in grass that's short, for instance, when they were building the chimney, if they just took the dried grass that had been cut, that turned out not to work very well. He would have looked for the longest grass he could find. And indeed, last summer when they rehabbed the chimney, they went out and they bought some hay. And so he would have taken the longest grass that he could find and bundled the grass and soaked the grass in the mud until the grass could help him create not just fistfuls of mud, but something rather like a mortar brickish kind of thing, a soft, malleable brick. And he could push those that grass, that soaking grass, into the gaps, and then daub the mud he had made over that. So he could do that all the way up to the top. And while he was doing that, a good chore for young boys in the neighborhood, or one of the people he may have had access to at the time was a young girl who was enslaved to Lewis Wicker, and he may have been able to hire her services from Lewis Wicker, that she would come over and she might have been able to work on mixing mud while George got up on a ladder and built that chimney. Finally he gets to the chimney and he needs to crown it, and he uses stones to crown the chimney. And he's done. It dries and everything went perfectly until it rains, because it's still mud. So the next thing we need to understand about Vance George and his cabin project and his chimney project is he's never done. And like so many chores that the people would have had to live with day to day in the frontier times around here, nothing is ever done. You're always maintaining because nature is always trying to reclaim. You're always trying to carve civilization out of nature, and nature is always trying to reclaim what you took from her. So let's leave the cabin from there. There's many other things we could talk about, but let's leave the cabin from there and simply go on to the idea of that economy that these people are plugged into. The 1860 census of the 15th district gives us a little bit of information about Hardin County, and one of them, we find that Hardin County has, on the census, they grow a lot of corn. They grew more corn than anything else. So if we're thinking of this as being a cotton area, there is some of that, but they grow a lot of corn. They grow comparatively little grains. They have comparatively little rye and wheat, although we know there are some wheat fields from the battle history where the report said there was wheat in this field. But comparatively little of those grains. They made a lot of beeswax. So they cultivated what the bees could do for them, and they grew a fair amount of sorghum so that they could use sorghum around the house. Also, sorghum can be made into molasses, and molasses can be put in barrels and taken down to Hamburg and put on a boat and sent elsewhere. Corn is also a marketable a product that is marketable in many ways. First of all, the corn they grow can be used to feed domestic animals, and they have plenty of domestic animals. But beyond that, corn can also, there's at least one really good way that corn can be converted into capital. Corn can be converted into money, and that's to distill corn into its liquid version. So they could take the corn and they could distill it and they could put it in barrels, and they could take those barrels down to Hamburg and they could put them on the river boats, and they will always find someone who will buy that corn from them. and that's one other way that they're connected in to the market. When we look at the animals that these folks owned, we will find a preponderance of animals that have practical usage. So they have a lot of mules. The census finds a lot of mules on this part of Hardin County, and very few horses. A few of the people of the upper classes would have horses for riding. Would be able to buy a horse for riding, but most of the stock animals are going to be ox and mules, animals that they would use for work. Plenty of swine. And as we often repeat in the battle histories when we're trying to explain the nature of the woods out there, plenty of swine, most of which are free-ranging around here. So they're out there eating in the woods, and then people can go out. If they need to harvest a swine, they go out and they find one and they kill him. And if they want to mark a swine as property, they might notch its ears and hope someone else respects that brand. And then goats. There's some goats and sheep around here as well. Let's see if there's anything else on the agricultural census that I wanted to catch up on. And then, yeah, finally, after these staples, they want to grow enough staples as they can to feed themselves, but then as much more, the maximum amount more that they can, to export to the greater economy and bring in money. And the biggest money maker at the time was cotton. And there were cotton fields around here. And Mance George cultivated a cotton field just south and southwest from his peach orchard, from the peach orchard he did. We know that because the Confederates were mad about having to attack across it on April 6, 1862, trying to march across a cotton field, especially an old cotton field that from the previous year is no fun at all. And so they tended to mention a cotton field when they had to march through it, that it was. So Mansfield George had a cotton field, and this is an important point about the geography down there. There are many more cotton fields down there because a greater access to Hamburg, which is all of this cotton. None of this cotton is going to be milled here. There's no mill around here anywhere. There's a gin, but there are no mills around here. So the cotton is going to have to be baled and taken down to Hamburg and sent to market. Cotton is a crop that requires an enormous amount of physical labor, to cultivate and harvest, and thus it is the most important crop for the slave trade, not the slave trade, but for slavery to assist in the trade of cotton, cultivation of cotton. So here again, the small number of people who are enslaved here, living here enslaved, are going to be either used to work in the farms of the people that are the slave masters that own them, or they might be hired out to someone like Mance George. And as you think about it, how could Mance George, with no help at all, cultivate an entire cotton field? Maybe he did. I'll give him credit, but probably he would have had to hire enslaved people from some of his neighbors to come and help him. Now, the neighbors that had the most slaves, and indeed the people of the neighborhood of the highest economic level, two of them were the Fraleys and the Woods. And there were several families of Wood that live around here, and the Fraleys. And one, I can't remember which member of the Wood family, but the gent that owned the Wood field had a cotton gin immediately next to it. So anybody in the neighborhood, once they harvested the cotton, they could gin it over here at Wood's Cotton Mill. And they would probably have to pay him, and then And then once it was ginned and baled, it could be taken down to Hamburg Landing and make it out into the market. So you're going to see this more and more across that landscape. There's cotton gin down there. There are more cotton fields down there. The families that own slaves are down there. Shiloh Church is down there, the church where that community chose to set up their new church after the schism in the 1840s. The Bark Road is down there. The Ridge Road is down there. So the highest and the driest roads are down there, and they all lead to Hamburg, where there's a landing and there's a little town and there's a little market. There's a tanyard down there. So you get down to the lower, the southern end of what is the Battlefield Park, and that is where the real community was, because that is where the community was plugged in to the economy. I think the last thing I can talk to you about now, we would have walked over to the mule lot, and we've talked a little bit about the mules, and we've talked a little about the fencing, but I also would have pointed out the roads. The roads are going to be the crucial connectors of everybody to the river. And we would have seen that all of the roads in the area, most of the roads in the area, led to Hamburg, and all of the roads in the area led to the Tennessee River. Now, one of the soldiers that wrote about the Battle of Shiloh described the local roads as being branches of the Tennessee River, meaning that at any given time, the roads had as much water flowing through them as the Tennessee River did. But they tended to be muddy. And and here I'll differ with this source, in order to make the road more effective for the people that live here, roads tend to be not like rivers, roads tend to be the exact opposite of rivers. And therefore they're like rivers in that they are 180 degrees different. Rivers seek the lowest, water seeks the lowest ground. Roads seek the highest ground, so that it goes over dry ground, always seeking dry ground. Rivers meander. They meander back and forth as they cut through the landscape. Yet some water pools in the roads, creating parts of the roads that are no longer useful, so people meander back and forth over the dry ground. And just like rivers, people in their roads tend to meander within a channel. The Tennessee River meanders down the landscape, but it doesn't break out of its channel. There are blocks on either side, and the roads that run over Pea Ridge, down here where the community of Mickey is now, the Mickey's up there because the roads seek the high ground, people seek the high ground, and then the road meanders around wet spots, but within a channel. They're not going to go off the edge of the ridge. And so these are the characteristics of the frontier roads. They're constantly changing, and they're malleable, and they're constantly changing. They move back and forth, and the people that live here have not yet reached the technological ability to straighten and pave the roads. They'll do that in another generation. Little inside baseball on that. When David W. Reed was setting up and interpreting Shiloh National Military Park, when it first became a park, he had a park engineer, Atwell Thompson, whose job was to lay out the physical aspects of the park, such as setting up the monuments and building the roads and such like this. And Reed lived in Cincinnati at first, so he wasn't here supervising. And he kept finding out that Thompson was taking all of the roads and straightening them. Engineers! And Reed would have to come back and go, "No, Thompson, I'm trying to have the roads in their original historic places." And Thompson could not see that. He goes, no, that's not straight. That's a terrible road. I'm not going to build a bad road. I'm proud of my engineering. I'm not going to build a bad road. Eventually, clearly Thompson won that argument because we drive on very nice roads out here and they go straight from one place to another. But as we're going over the landscape, we remember that at the time the roads meandered back and forth in a channel. Well, that's about all I can cover right now. There's a lot of other stuff we're going to talk about because we look at the landscape and show the landscape. And someday we'll do that. But my hope is that we've done two things. One, illustrate how the folks back then lived and how they used nature to live, and how their relationship with nature was one of utility. They used nature and they tried to focus nature and force nature to, help them. And then, of course, nature's response to that was usually antithetical to what they wanted. But it's a constant, so that constant tug of the frontier between nature and them trying to focus nature and control nature, and then nature pushing back and doing what it does. And then the second most important part, and I think this is the most important thing to me. I thought it was the most interesting. The people that live on this frontier, just like the people that lived in the frontier country where I grew up, which is Kansas, just like the people that took the Oregon Trail to California, none of these people embarked on these adventures because they wished to escape from the market or from communities. Well, maybe Jeremiah Johnson did. Maybe Robert Redford wished to escape civilization. But none of the other pioneers, none of the other frontier people did that because they wished to escape civilization. They did that because they were seeking opportunity. And they, therefore, were seeking an opportunity to expand what they considered civilization into nature. And that nature would now be, focused on, reformed into civilization. And a major part of that civilization was the market. They intended to take the market with them. And they did take the market with them. They were always plugged into the market. So they were always buying, they were always selling, they were always trading. And Mance George's little cabin would have had plenty of canned or mason jar food, packed food that they would have saved and eaten. And they might have gone to Hamburg and bought some salted pork, preserved food to eat for later. They might have had a little closet where they had clothes that had been created elsewhere and brought in and they bought. That was the idea. And so here they lived on the frontier, and it seems remote, and it is remote, and a major part of their life was working with and against nature, but all of them had the goal and lived their life plugged in to a market and connected to the people all across the country, from New York or Charleston to here. And that was a major part of their lives. Well, thank you very much. I'll do my best to answer any other questions. I think I might have told you everything I know at this point. But if you have any questions or if you have any input, because as I said at the beginning, I came from Chicago, and some of y'all may know a lot more about life down here than I do. So thank you very much. If you have any questions.
What's his name? Kevin Getchell.
Kevin Getchell, okay.
He's doing another book. He did the first one on Lou Wallace. He was over there this weekend selling his books and so forth. He's in the process of doing another book on civilians in the American Civil War.
Okay.
And he's going to use Shiloh for an example.
Okay.
He's going to give them different names. Sarah Bell will be Mary Jones.
Okay.
It could be applied to different battles. And he wants me to, have you got a card?
I do have a card. I know him.
Okay. But he's and I'm not bragging when I say this, but I've got 25 plus grandmothers and grandfathers going all the way back to 1840 in the Shiloh
Okay.
Log Church Cemetery, on and on and on and on. But I showed him all the old house sites that were here of my family in the battle and before and after and so forth. But he very much would like to talk to you. I told him, you know, and he couldn't make it. He was packing up and leaving part
Okay.
to help him on his understanding of civilians in the, the Battle of Shiloh, but it's going to apply to general book about civilians in the Civil War. So
I do what I can, yeah, sure.
yeah, give him a call if you don't care.
Okay,
Appreciate
okay.
it.
I have kind of a related question.
Yeah, right here.
What are the earliest maps of this area that would show what was here before the Army camps or at the same time as the Army camps?
Oh, I wish I could answer that question. I wasn't able to locate anything. Most of what I looked at, in order to get that data, the historical data, was the agricultural census of 1860. And then county history that was written. And I can't remember the author right now, or I'd give you the citation. But I didn't find anything that would give me good maps.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
You might know, one of you might know the answer to this. Like, where are like Mance George and Sarah Bell? Where are they buried?
I don't know the answer to that.
I haven't seen them in the cemetery. I've been out to look at when I can, and I haven't found them out there.
To the Shiloh
Yeah,
Church
the
Cemetery?
Shiloh Church, I haven't
Okay.
found them.
But most all the old grave cemetery are on the same side but back, you know, from the church.
Yeah.
But there's no markers, but there's a lot of graves back there.
Yeah, okay.
I know that Noah Cantrell's family is buried, part of them is buried there.
Okay.
I've got a little book at home I need to bring, and it's a diary of a young girl, Ada Cantrell.
Yeah, look, okay.
And she was 12 years old, 10 or 12, and the family left here for safety, and Noah took the family away. And she was, let's see, she was mute, and deaf mute, but she could see. And she wanted to know what everything was going on. And so
Okay.
they taught her how to read and write. And her story was what her life was like moving from here to Texas in a covered wagon. And what she saw, the birth of the babies, the dying of folks. She saw all of this, but she wanted to know everything that was on it. And it's a small little book. I'll bring it to you.
Wonderful, I'd like to
But,
see it sometime.
The reason that they said they used the Cantrell house was because it was a plank wood. It
Okay.
wasn't log, and they thought that it looked better. than the
Okay.
others, so but there was, I don't know if they found them or not, but there's, some of them didn't want to get their family heirlooms taken from them. They planned on coming back. They didn't want to be robbed. So they would bury them on their property. And
Okay.
they thought they would be coming back, but when they came back, they couldn't even find the property.
Right.
So lost out. So there was a lot of that going on all over these folks around the region.
Sure.
They were a tough breed.
They
And I
were.
married part of that family.
So what kind of family connection did he claim?
Well,
That's our story, and we're
Yeah.
sticking to it, whatever.
we bring the pamphlets and the feeders, we record them.
Okay.
So how close is the battlefield to kind of the way it was back during the battle as compared to as now?
Hey,
Are
neighbor,
there
how you
fields where there were
doing?
fields, are there forest and
You been here all
woods where
weekend?
there are forest and woods now?
Fellas, if you could take it over here if you want. Yeah, what was it like?
The topography of the land pretty much as far as open fields where there were,
Right.
fields then and so forth. It's
In
pretty
some
close
ways,
to
it's
where-
very close. In
Okay.
some ways, it's very close.
Right.
When the Park Commission came in 1895, they looked for locals that could tell them what it was like at the time. And many had moved on because of the experience with the war. But some of them were still here, and they were able to find plenty of people that remembered the original layouts. That one fella, I cannot remember his name, but they did meet one old fella who, as a young man, was was in business building fences.
Okay.
So he distinctly remembered
sure.
the fence lines
Sure.
for the field, especially if somebody had paid him
Yeah.
to lay out that field and build
Yeah.
the fences for it. And so the fields, the field lines are very close. If you buy the map, the topographic map,
Yep.
it'll show you, field lines and then where the fields are overgrown with woods.
Sure.
So not everywhere you go, the field lines are right. The nature of the woods are different.
Yep.
The woods back then were old woods, old growth woods, a lot of oak at the time, and very little undergrowth. Again, the free range practices of letting the animals browse underneath cleaned a lot of that out.
Yep.
And then when the army came, they cleaned the rest
Right.
out. So an old growth forest, and so this forest is not like that at all. But the fields are very similar, yeah. And the state of preservation as far as looking at the battlefield and seeing the way it was when the soldiers were here, about as close as we could accomplish, I think.
Yeah. Is there any restorative efforts, as, saying you're gonna take a certain area and clean it out, or try to put the way it was, kinda like they did at Gettysburg?
Sure.
I mean, Gettysburg, is,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they're
focus
doing
on
all
that.
sorts of stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
That's always on their mind, but that's also an expensive
Yes, right.
proposition. And
cost versus benefits. So.
right, yeah, there's some things that are not worth doing. One thing that's always worth doing, because the cost is considerably lower, is the controlled burns. And so just about every winter, they come up, the Shiloh Park does some sort of project where they, bring in forestry people and they set up a controlled burn, and then they can burn out, at least for a season or two, that undergrowth. And if you come to the park during that time, you can see areas of the park where the woods are much closer to the way they were. One of the things you'll see, like when Gettysburg, when they took all of that timber right off of Little Round Top in order to restore the view shed there, that involved a huge grant, and a huge grant project, and people came in and did that work. But it does get done. Chickamauga did that too with the vineyard field, and it can be pretty remarkable when they do it. I don't think it can be done. I haven't seen anybody want to do it for a whole battlefield.
Sure.
But like one condensed part of a battlefield,
Perryville's
important
got
part.
a huge acreage. In fact, I was just there, and they still have the slashings piled up from where
Do
they
they?
log.
Okay.
And boulders, and then they're putting in prairie grasses, or, prairie
Prairie
grasses,
grass?
or whatever was.
Oh, that's going to be
there.
wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so like the vista is pretty much back to what it was during the battle.
Perryville's a Kentucky state park,
Right.
so I was sort of, we were both assuming you were asking about national parks. But, yeah, it can be done, but it's an expensive proposition.
Yeah, and they got a bunch of money from the Battlefield Trust.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming out. The next program is tomorrow morning. I believe it's at 9 o'clock, but ask at the desk. Don't take my word for it from here. And that will be our usual car caravan out to Fallen Timbers.
Leaves from here.
Leaves from here, leaves from the visitor center. And we'll car caravan to Fallen Timbers and Pebble Hill Church and talk about the pursuit after the battle. And then in the afternoon, we're going to do a car caravan program in Corinth. All right? Thank you very much.
It's fall term.